Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5-Watt World, where we're interested to help you get the most music from the least gear. Fender spent most of the 50s furiously innovating their electric guitar line. However, when it came to the electric bass, the pace of progress had been comparatively slow. As the P-Bass settled into its new split pickup identity by '57, Leo and company began to imagine a new deluxe bass guitar, which would become the Fender Jazz Bass. This is the 5-Watt World short history of the J-Bass. If you enjoy our videos, take a minute to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when we put out new videos. And if you've already subscribed, swing by the store and grab a t-shirt or a mug to support what we're doing here. There's a link in the description. Much like the Stratocaster guitar being issued as an upscale guitar to the Telecaster, by '59, Fender was ready to release a bass in their lineup above the Precision. In standard sunburst finish for the kingly price of $279.50, an incredible $2,422.57 in 2019 dollars, the world was introduced to the Jazz Bass, though as it turns out, Fender had begun producing them in March of 1960. Don Randall, the head of Fender's marketing and distribution company, noted, "We were always market-driven. After establishing the fact that bass guitars would sell and that people wanted them, then the next thing was to make a prettier one, a more elaborate one. We wanted an upscale model to put on the market. The Jazz Bass wasn't Leo's idea particularly. It was more of a marketing idea, something that we wanted in order to expand the line." So it was an idea that came out of Don Randall's marketing and sales division, and like the Stratocaster, it would be Randall that named the Jazz Bass. After considering the Deluxe model, it was renamed in an attempt to appeal to jazz bass players. Ironically, and somewhat understandably, upright players often preferred the wider neck of the P-Bass when they moved over to an electric. Whatever the motivation, the Jazz Bass was an aesthetic evolution of the ideas started with the Precision. Compared to the P-Bass, the Jazz had a slightly larger body, made of alder or occasionally of ash. The increased size means that Jazz Basses are often a little heavier, and that extra mass can provide more resonance. It featured the offset waist of the Jazzmaster guitar that Fender had launched as its new premier model in '58, making it more comfortable to play sitting down, as most serious players of the time tended to do. It also had a narrower string spacing at the nut, giving the neck a more tapered feel. The Jazz Bass was 1 7/16 at the nut, whereas the Precision was a full 1 3/4 inches. Consequently, many guitarists switching over to bass felt the Jazz Bass neck was more manageable. But the biggest and most visible difference was that it had 2 pickups instead of 1, providing tonal versatility not to be found on the P-Bass. The Jazz Bass prototype had large soap bar-style single-coil pickups similar to those of a Jazzmaster guitar, but they didn't have the tone that Fender was looking for. So they were redesigned into the familiar, narrower pickups with 8 pull pieces, 2 per string, seen on the first production guitars. As a consequence of the phase cancellation of certain frequencies in the middle settings between the 2 pickups, the bass is capable of a unique mid-scooped and forward sound, uncommon in other bass guitars. Perhaps more than in the guitars, the tonal consequences of reverse winding designed to cancel the hum of the '50s lighting contributed directly to the voice of the instrument. While the neck pickup provided the warm, round sound similar to a P-Bass, the real driver was the bridge pickup that produced a mid-range punch and trebly high end that was new to Fender basses at the time. In 1960, the first Jazz Basses were released with a standard sunburst finish and a tortoiseshell-style pickguard. They had a 21-fret, slab-style rosewood fingerboard with clay dots on a maple neck. The finger rest was mounted below the G-string, continuing with Leo's assumption that players would rest their fingers there and pluck the strings with their thumb, or play with a pick. There was a top-loader bridge, and there were individual adjustable mutes for each string mounted to the body. There were, of course, the often-removed covers on the front pickup and the bridge. The first Jazz Basses were released with dual concentric control pots. Fender referred to them as tandem volume and tone controls, and today they're generally referred to as stack knobs. This control layout has similar function to what you'd find on a 2-pickup Gibson guitar, like a Les Paul. There were 2 stacks, one for each pickup, each with a tone control on top and a volume knob underneath. Each tone knob was notched and had 10 different positions. Along with the 2 volume controls, you could mix the 2 pickups in very different ways. Though these controls didn't end up being popular at the time, this layout has caught on more recently with players like session ace Bobby Vega and the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Flea, because of the wide variety of available sounds. The Flea signature basses that Fender has released, like this Roadrun version here, have these stacked control knobs. Fender began tweaking the Jazz Bass almost immediately. By December of 61, Fender would change the control layout to the now classic 3 knobs, 2 larger volume knobs, 1 for each pickup, and a smaller master tone control. The layout used on the prototype of all things. Stack knob jazz basses continued to be built well into 62, using up the parts that were in stock, and this sometimes leads to confusion about when the change was actually made. Between 60 and 61, 2 additional patent numbers were added to the headstock decal, and by 61, Fender began offering 14 custom colors, many with matching headstocks, and most of these were released with white nitrocellulose pickguards. The slab rosewood fingerboards would last until late in 62, when they would be moved to a thinner, almost laminate curved fingerboard. These would be the last slab boards Fender would make until the authentic reissues in the early 1980s. The slab board basses have a different sound altogether, warmer and rounder than the laminate boards. Players that made the 62 jazz basses famous include John Paul Jones and, of course, Jaco Pastorius. In 63, the individual string mutes mounted to the body were replaced with an all-string mute glued to the inside of the bridge cover. 64 was the last year before Fender was sold to CBS. It would have the laminate fingerboard, and during 64 they transitioned from the original clay dot inlays over to the pearloid dots on the neck. From 66 on, there were a lot of changes, as CBS basically was just trying things to see what the market would like. One of these changes was to move to a bound fretboard, and 66 saw the first year of the Lollipop tuners that were built in-house at Fender. These new tuners also meant that the tuners didn't turn backwards anymore. In 67, Fender switched from the dot markers to the pearl block markers on the neck. By late 68, the clover tuner knobs were back. Also by late 68, the strap button on the back of the headstock had finally gone away. In 69, a larger and bolder logo decal appeared. Also in 69, a maple fingerboard, bound in black with black markers, was introduced as an option. By the mid-60s, soul sessions at Atlantic that didn't feature Chuck Rainey on his P-bass probably had Jerry Jemmett on his 65 jazz bass. Wilson Pickett, Aretha Franklin, King Curtis, B.B. King, and countless others relied on Gemmett's bass. Jemmett said of his jazz bass, "I never wanted to depart from my jazz roots, so the name alone was an inspiration to me. And the character of the sound, a raw, punchy, tight, cutting tone, was great for the syncopation, ghost notes, and dynamics I was playing." In a 1984 interview, Jaco Pastorius said of Jemmett, "He was my idol, making the sounds I wanted to make." Early in his career, Jack Cassidy played a Fender Jazz Bass with a Jefferson Airplane. The propulsive groove of White Rabbit and the weaving lines of Somebody to Love were both his jazz bass. Led Zeppelin's John Paul Jones can be heard playing his jazz bass on Dazed and Confused and Good Times, Bad Times. And in 68, James Brown was putting together a new band, and it included an 18-year-old Bootsy Collins playing his new block inlay, Sunburst jazz bass. It was around this time that Larry Graham, of Sly and the Family Stone fame, is credited with developing the first slapping technique on his jazz bass he called Sunshine. When the drummer in his trio left unexpectedly, he began hitting the lower strings with his thumb to cover the bass drum part. He'd also pluck high strings with his index finger to simulate the snare and the backbeat. He said he wasn't looking to create an innovation. He was just looking to, quote, keep his job, end quote. Out of necessity came a new way of playing that would be instrumental in creating funk. Like Rocco Prestia from Tower of Power on his modified Precisions, Verdine White of Earth, Wind & Fire was a great funk finger stylist, but over on a jazz bass. His fluid lines and sophisticated harmony belied his jazz and classical music background. Though they were used by many players in the 60s, it was truly the 70s when the jazz bass came into its own. This was the time of Larry Graham, John Paul Jones, Barry Oakley, Will Lee, Anthony Jackson. All were forming their personal styles on J-Bass. All of these guys helped see the transition in New York City from the precision to the jazz as the studio musician's bass of choice in that decade. Will Lee would switch to a jazz bass after his beloved Precision was lost in an apartment fire. He said, "The two pickup configuration of the J-Bass is the most practical design for bassists. Its sonic versatility enables players to seamlessly glide to and from different styles of music, while affording the choice between sounding fat and round or thin and nasally. In 1972, there was a change that you might not notice at a glance, but would make a profound difference in tone. The bridge pickup was moved 4/10 of an inch closer to the bridge, giving the bridge pickup much more bite. Perhaps this is why Rush's Geddy Lee has gravitated to the post-72 style jazz bass. Geddy's main riff of YYZ is unquestionably one of the most recognized jazz bass recordings. By 1974, Fender had started to transition from a 4-bolt neck plate to the 3-bolt with micro-tilt adjustment. Around the same time, the bullet truss rod was introduced. Now, truss rod adjustments could be done without removing the neck from the guitar. Also in '76, the headstock logo was changed yet again, and the serial numbers moved from the neck plate up to the headstock. In '77, the control knobs were changed to black plastic with numbers. By the late '70s, the fact that jazz bass was slightly heavier to start with was exaggerated by the heavier wood being used to build the bodies, creating some particularly beastly examples. And just as the jazz bass was becoming the tool of choice for many, along came Jaco. You can't talk about the jazz bass or electric bass at all without spending some time talking about Jaco Pastorius. He'd started on drums, but after breaking his wrist playing football, he switched over to bass, and it wasn't long after that he'd proclaim himself to be the world's greatest bass player. Though an outrageous thing to claim, by most accounts, it was true. Although Jaco claimed at times that his first jazz bass was a 1960 model, early photos showed him holding an instrument with block inlays that would date it as being made in late '66 or early '67 at the earliest. But then Jaco was famous for telling stories in interviews, always the entertainer. Later on, Jaco acquired the '62 jazz bass that became known as the Bass of Doom, on which he recorded most of his best-known music. Reversing the direction Leo Fender started with the precision bass, he pulled the frets out of the fingerboard, filled the fret slots with wood putty. Then, to protect the fingerboard from the Rotosound round-wound strings he used, he coated it with several layers of marine epoxy. This created a smooth, hard surface that gave his bass a unique and singing quality. He said of his proficiency on the fretless, "It's like I'm the first guy to be using a fretless bass and really getting down and play it. Because nobody can play it. They cannot play it in tune. I play in tune, like a cello player." Among Jaco's many innovations beyond playing things on the fretless that bassists are still trying to do on their fretted instruments was playing a rolling 16th note style he learned playing in R&B bands in southern Florida. It gave Jaco's lines tremendous momentum. He also mastered the use of both natural and artificial harmonics as a way of extending the range of the bass. This was enhanced by his heavy use of the bridge pickup, and added to his use of the fretless with its ability to slide between notes to create fluid lines out of microtones, allowed him to drive bands with profound rhythmic accuracy. He would play double stops that helped to fill out his parts like Hendrix had done on guitar, and also following in Hendrix's footsteps, he developed a huge and flamboyant stage presence. After a dramatic audition for Blood, Sweat, and Tears drummer Bobby Colomby, Colomby recommended him to Epic Records, and Jaco signed a solo deal, the result of which was the 1975 album simply titled Jaco Pastorius. It is without a doubt the most influential and important electric bass record ever made. It showed that the Fender Jazz Bass could be used as a lead voice in an ensemble, and that there were seemingly no limit to the expression possible with the instrument. Tidily released 25 years after the release of the first Fender Precision in 1951, it captured more than Leo had ever dreamed of for his creation. Sadly, we lost Jaco too soon. While working on this video, I realized it was the 32nd anniversary of his passing on September 21st, 1987. It's a sign of how out of touch Fender had become by the mid-'70s, that even at the height of Jaco's popularity, they didn't offer a fretless jazz bass. Quality had slipped, but more importantly, relying on musicians to inform the direction of the company was lost to Fender at that time. This trend was finally reversed when CBS hired Bill Schultz to revamp the company in 1982. The first thing Schultz did with his new team was to start what is now referred to as the Fullerton Reissues Project. They began buying up vintage instruments to use as models. Studying these originals, they set about creating reissues on the original machines in the Fullerton factory. They built 3 basses in the reissue series, including a '62 jazz bass. The reissues were accurate in most all details, though collectors would note that the 12th fret dot markers were slightly closer together than the originals, and that they chose to use the stack knob controls that were more common on the 60 and 61 basses. From 82 to 84, the US standard J bass changed to a single-ply white pickguard that incorporated the original metal control plate to save money. They also switched to white knobs and pickup covers at the same time. The binding and block inlays went away. This was also the first time you could get a jazz bass with a solid maple neck. In 1985, CBS sold Fender to an investor group headed by then-President Bill Schultz. They continued to restore quality and once again listened to artists for inspiration and modifications. It was at that time that the first fretless jazz bass was produced, including a custom shop special, Jaco Pastorius Relic jazz bass. Though not initially popular with the jazz musicians that the name seemed to be targeting, the jazz bass went on to be embraced by an endless number of players and in an equally endless number of styles of music. In fact, Fender has released more signature jazz bass models than any other guitar in their line, including Marcus Miller, Reggie Hamilton, Victor Bailey, Steve Bailey, and and of course, the Jaco model. Daryl Jones, who leapt onto the scene in the mid-'80s in gigs with Miles Davis, Sting, and the Rolling Stones, said of the J-Bass, "During the development of my signature bass, which is based on a pre-CBS Jazz, I discovered that the original passive electronics of the early J-Basses allowed them to be heard in a way that basses with active electronics sometimes cannot be heard, particularly in larger venues. There's an immediacy of sound with passive instruments. I call it bark. Just another aspect that Leo got so right." Still, the wave of active electronic in basses in the 90s touched the jazz as well. Marcus Miller is likely the player that put the active J-bass tone in front of the largest audience. Miller remembers, "The active idea came from Roger Sadowski, who was maintaining my bass. He recommended and installed a preamp to give me some control of my sound in the fast pace of the studio. When I listen back now, I really hear the difference in tone, growly before the preamp and more rounder after. Best of all, it was still the sound of the J-bass, with a little bit of steroids." And the first Fender 5-string bass tuned B to G was released as an American Deluxe Jazz Bass 5 in 1995. It had a downsized body, a 22-fret neck, and it featured abalone dot inlays. As we come to the 2000s, Fender had 9 different J-bass models in their line. This included the 24-fret Deluxe Jazz that came out around 2005. Mars Volta bassist Juan Eldoret is a fan of the subtleties you can pull from a jazz bass. In an interview in Bass Player magazine, he said, "The J-bass was what my heroes, Jaco and John Paul Jones, played, so I set out to follow their lead. Initially, I was drawn to the deep bass response of both pickups, but once I realized that Jaco favored the rear pickup, it changed my whole approach to music. Harmonics, string scratching, and how feedback sounded all came to light for me. Sonically, the J-bass sits solidly with the bass drum. Overall, bass became meaner and more profound in the band when the J-bass came on the scene." If you were into Jimi Hendrix's Experience, you were listening to a jazz bass in either Noel Redding or Billy Cox's hands. The extraordinary bass breaks that John Entwistle played on The Who's My Generation were recorded on a jazz bass after he'd broken the strings on 3 successive Danelectros he'd wanted to use. Ron Blair with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Adam Clayton and U2, UK session great Herbie Flowers made history on David Bowie's Space Oddity. All of it recorded with a jazz bass. Those of you that have watched this series know that I've relied heavily on Tony Bacon's excellent guitar history books in my research for these videos. When Tony did his The Bass Book with Barry Moorhouse, it was a Fender Jazz Bass that they decided should be on the cover. And I think that probably says it all. I'd like to thank Anthony Muthuraja for composing and playing the music used in the video. I find Anthony's excellent YouTube channel of bass lessons and philosophy, all with his White Squire jazz bass in hand, to be both insightful and inspirational. I highly recommend him to you. There's a link to his channel below. I'd like to thank the redoubtable Dave Honorato of Dojo Guitar Repair in Atlanta, my vintage instrument expert, for his always insightful help with the script. And special thanks to Perry McManus for his informed editing on yet another 40-page script. I highly recommend the 2014 documentary Jaco, the film. 3 books in particular made this video possible: How the Fender Bass Changed the World by Jim Roberts, The Fender Jazz Bass, An Illustrated History by J.W. Black and Albert Molinaro, and The Bass Book by Tony Bacon and Barry Moorhouse. The books and the movies are linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this short history of the Fender Jazz Bass, hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that too. Remember to click the bell icon to be notified when we put out a new video. If you want to support these videos, stop by the store and grab a t-shirt or a mug. Thanks for watching. Until next time, thanks for being a part of the 5-Watt world.